That never gets old, does it? You know, there's something about making a decision at a young age that a lot of us wish we could have. You know, we think of making it later, and sometimes we think it's too late for us, but it's never too late for anybody. But there is something special about making a decision early, and hopefully being able to avoid a lot of the stuff that some of you recognize didn't help in life because you waited a little bit longer. So thanks again for Jake for celebrating this day with us, and for all of his family and friends being here today to celebrate as well. Great start to what we hope is a forever kind of experience for him and for others. So, hey, thanks for joining us today. We're actually starting a brand new message series today called Redacted. We're talking about those parts of the Bible that we just wish we could avoid. You know, and if you're first time with us today, maybe first time back in a church, maybe first time in a church at all, the good news for you is, you know, if you're not sort of consider yourself a follower of Jesus, you can kind of look in today, hear what we talk about, and decide if it sort of works for you. I think it works for anybody. But it's especially important for those of us that consider ourselves followers of Jesus. Because there's this call that he has on our lives to actually follow him in the teachings, in the guidance, and the things that he hopes will take place in our lives. But if we're honest, and I hope we are, there are parts that we would just as soon avoid stuff that Jesus said. For example, Jesus said, love your enemies. Not just tolerate them, but to love them. You're supposed to pray for them. You're supposed to bless those who curse you, which, by the way, if you drive in rush hour traffic here this past week, you probably had multiple opportunities to bless somebody, right? But we're faced with this kind of picture of a God who invites us into this unique and different sort of relationship that's based on this idea of grace and mercy and love and acceptance. And God hopes not only does it come our way, but that it works in our lives and moves out to other people. And let's be honest. When we talk about the issue of forgiveness, our struggle with it, it's real. Some of us have a real hard time forgiving that person. And I don't even have to say their name. I just say those two words, that person, and you know exactly who that person is. Some of you have a hard time forgiving yourself because of all the stuff that's gone on in your life. Some of us have a hard time going and asking for somebody to forgive us because of all the things that go out. And we're faced not only with the love your enemy and pray for them and bless them, we're faced with passages like this when Jesus was talking and sort of laying out sort of this picture of what life looks like as a follower of his when he says, in everything we do to others what you want them to do to you. That is, treat others as you want them to treat you. And as we read that, you notice it says, it's not do unto others as others deserve to be done to, because we completely understand that, right? And it's not do unto others as they've done to you, because we understand the idea, you did this to me, I'm going to come back at you. But it's do unto others as you want them done to you. And sometimes we've read that passage as, well, you know, if I had done that same knucklehead thing, I'd want somebody to be tough with me too. Which, by the way, is not what Jesus is after with this statement, all right? He's talking about how would we treat, how we would want to be treated if this wasn't simply sort of a black and white thing, because we all know it's not just simply black and white, because ours, we have multiple layers. There's all this kind of stuff, and we want people to understand that I did that, officer, but I didn't mean it to speed. In fact, let me tell you why I may have been speeding, because this is going on, that's going on, I got to get here. We have all this explanation. And as we'd want them to hear that, he says that's how you ought to look at it. In fact, he will go on and say that this idea of doing to others as we'd want done to us, this sums up, this is the meaning of the law of Moses and the teaching of the prophets. This kind of encapsulates everything that the Bible has talked about, everything that God has tried to been telling people for thousands and thousands of years is summed up in this simple idea, how we treat others. It says an awful lot, but how we treat ourselves and how we see God. But there's something when we think about this idea of forgiveness that you share with me And it's this. Because you have a story, right? And when you talk about forgiveness, you think, yes, I understand Jesus says I'm supposed to forgive, but let me tell you a story. And I've heard some incredible stories over the course of my pastoring. I mean, I've heard people tell me stories, and I've thought, man, you were exactly right. I would not forgive that person either. I mean, what's happened to you? What the innocence that was taken away from your childhood, the craziness that went on, the impact that one decision or those multiple decisions has had on the rest of your life. Yeah, I hear your story because we all have a story. And we all think we are the exception to when Jesus says, forgive others. To forgive them. You know, we say you're supposed to forgive, and you say, Mike, you don't know my story. You don't know how much I hurt and the pain that I carry with me to this day. When we talk about forgiving ourselves, some of us say, Mike, you don't know my story. You don't know how far I've gone. You don't know the stuff that I've done in my life, how low I've gotten, the stuff I've done to other people. I am beyond the point of no return because you don't know my story. And the question I want to ask you this morning, and hopefully have you carry through the rest of this series, is simply this. You have a story. And you think because you have that story, you're the exception. But what if you aren't the exception? Because we all have a story, right? So before we jump into this, and by the way, I'll give you my goal here as we start. If you came today thinking, why is he talking about forgiveness? I don't have anybody to forgive. My whole goal is to give you somebody to forgive today, and that person may be me, all right? So I think part of my job as your pastor is to help you experience these things, to give you some practice. But honestly, these next few weeks could be painful, extremely painful for some of you. And that's because our lives are bouncing up against sort of what we see as black and white statements. And we recognize that so little in life is sort of this black and white. Because there's always these nuances and these stories, right? But what Jesus, I think, is after, as he said those words we looked at a moment ago, and all those different kind of words, when he calls us this incredible idea of loving our enemies, praying for them, of blessing those who persecute us, of treating others as we want to be treated. What he's after is not simply for us to say, I have to do it because he says I have to do it. What he's after is people who have become to appreciate their own experience of those things towards themselves to the level where they just can't do anything else. And I'm not there. I hope some of you are there. But sometimes we need to go back and revisit and bring these things back to light because it's easy to ignore these things. But that doesn't get us any farther along either. So before we jump into kind of the heart of what we're going to talk about today, I invite you to bow your heads and let's pray together one more time, all right? Father, this morning in this room are lots of stories. And the stories you know and that you understand, they are stories you have been a part of, whether clearly or just in your ability to know everything. And some of us are here today because of those stories. Because we're looking for some kind of hope. We're looking for some resolution. We're looking for freedom. And some of us have decided this is the place to find it. That we just keep coming back because just in the process of coming back, we recognize it sort of works. It's just over this time, this process. But for some of us, this issue is at the core of our lives. And it's hard because it really does color everything in our lives. It eats at us. It annoys us. And so, Father, this morning I simply want to ask you to use not just the words that are old today, but to use some concepts of trying to move ahead today. To show us that while we can do our part, there's a part that only you can do. And that's the part we seek today. In your Son's name, amen. I heard or read this description a couple of years ago, and I thought it really was a great definition of what forgiveness is. Forgiveness is, let's read this together, a decision to cancel a debt. That's what it means, to cancel a debt. Because somebody owes us something, and it's the idea of cancel. I'm no longer going to say that you owe this to me. While that seems like a nice definition, our problem is this. Right? Because if I forgive you, that means you get away with it. That you don't pay for it. That you don't have to carry some load, some part of the pain that I feel. And so in the midst of that, forgiveness just feels like this decision to reward my enemy. But the reality is, we need to get to this place where we say, you don't owe me any more. Because what we have to understand, what Jesus tries to teach over and over and over, is that forgiveness is 100% and total in the control of the person who needs to give it. It's not in the other person, as much as we think it's in their hands. If they just said they're sorry, but you know, even if they said they're sorry, no, that's not enough. I mean, you learned that early on, right? How many of you remember when you were a child and you did something to your brother or your sister or maybe some other kid you're playing with, and your mother looked at you, Eddie, and said, say you're sorry, right? Anybody else have that same thing? And you remember how honestly and joyfully and open before God and the whole universe you said, I'm sorry, right? No, you probably said it more like this, right? I'm sorry. Right? Or, I'm sorry. To which, if your mother was good, they looked at the other one and said, what do you say? You're forgiven, you know? We learn early and often that we're supposed to do this whole thing, but we learn how it just doesn't feel right, it doesn't kind of make sense, and the reality is it's only going to be the one who actually is the forgiving one, the one who needs to give it, or the one who needs to express it, that really is control and really has to get to this place of saying, you don't owe me anymore. But here's our problem. Here's our problem with forgiveness. I don't want to. I don't want to forgive them. But I remember what my mother said, Eddie. You're forgiven, you know, I'm supposed to say it. But let's be honest, sometimes we don't want to. Sometimes I enjoy being mad. Anybody there with me? Right? Sometimes there's something about it. I just kind of enjoy it. I mean, they've taken something from me, so I ought to be able to do something. I ought to be able to get mad and hold on to that madness because that's all I've got. They've taken something, so I got to have something to hold on to. Some of us don't want to let go because letting go means moving on. And if we move on, that's scary because we've gotten used to the story. We've got used to the feeling. We've got used to carrying this around with us. And oftentimes we don't want to do it because I have a story to tell. And I'm glad to tell it with anybody and everybody who asks me, what's my problem? You wonder what my problem is? Let me tell you. They did this, they did that, they still do this, they still do that. And you don't understand. You have no idea. And I tell my story because my story gives me a reason, gives me a rationale to keep holding on, to keep going back over and over this stuff. And I don't want to give up my story because if I don't have my story, what do I have? I've got nothing. you don't owe me anymore. See, the reality is, the reason this is such a big deal to Jesus, in fact, it's such a big deal that we'll look at sometime over the course of the next few weeks, this idea when Jesus will say, forgive others, and that's how you'll be forgiven. If you don't forgive others, you're not going to be forgiven. And we say, hold it here, Jesus, that time out, how does that work? That doesn't sound quite fair. You're going to hold me accountable for doing something I don't really want to do, but now I got to do it because I got to get it from you. And I don't say, well, we'll talk about that later, all right? But this idea of I have it and I'm letting go of it. And if you talk to somebody, if you hear the stories that I've heard of people who have these incredible stories of pain and of hurt, but who have come to the place of saying they don't owe me anymore. And what it's done to their lives, what the idea of forgiveness and freedom has done to their lives, is incredible. So let's look at a passage here. Luke chapter 17. And Luke is one of the New Testament writers. He's one of the ones that records the stories of Jesus. He wasn't there with it. He's gone out and found stories from different people. So Luke chapter 17 is this list of sort of statements that Jesus made. And so he'll say, Jesus said this, Jesus said that. He doesn't have any context, but he just is telling us some of the things that Jesus said, because Luke sees value in that. And here's one of the things Jesus said. He said to his followers, things that cause people to sin will happen. Things that cause us to be tempted and to sin are inevitable. And Jesus recognized that's an important thing, to understand things are going to happen. But Jesus says, how terrible for the person who causes them to happen. This is where we ought to cue that kind of dark music. Dun, dun. All right, thank you, yeah. Because this is like, oh mama moment, right? We know it's going to happen. It's going to come. It's inevitable. But if you're the one that brought it, oh no. It would be better for that person, the person who brings it, to be thrown into the sea with a large millstone around his neck than to cause one of these little ones to sin or stumble. It's better to get this huge stone that you need a donkey to move. You can't move it yourself as a person. You need that tap around, just thrown it. It'd be better for you to go that way than to be part of what happens to somebody else. And Jesus again raises the stake, not just on the inevitable that it's all going to happen, that stuff's going to come into our lives. You cannot prevent temptation from coming into your life. It's inevitable, but to be the person that brings it, oh, it's bad, Jesus says. And then he says these words to his followers. So be careful. Watch yourselves. I've got to keep looking back here in the corner. Looks like a tough crowd back there today. Why would Jesus tell his followers to watch themselves on this? If it wasn't for the reason that stuff happens, problems arise, it's inevitable. But we need to do everything possible we can to make sure we're not the cause of it or the continuation. In fact, Jesus goes on, Luke says, and says, if another follower, that is a fellow believer, sins, warn, that is, rebuke him. In other words, tell him he did something. This isn't simply forgive everybody. Somebody does something bad, you right away say, forgiven. No, this idea, you need to go explain something. Say, this is what you did. And he says, if he's sorry and stops sinning, repents, you forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times in one day, some you could actually translate this each day, every day, 7 times, 7 times, 7 times, 7 times. He keeps doing it, keeps coming back and saying, I'm sorry. Each time, you forgive him. Which is, again, one of those things which Jesus did not say. Because really, Jesus? Over and over, I have to keep forgiving this person over and over and over again? To which I love how the disciples respond. right? Help us, Jesus, because what you're asking is crazy. I mean, it's unbelievable. The reality is forgiveness is not a default position for us. Forgiveness is not natural. Forgiveness does not feel good when we're kind of faced with having to let go and say, you don't owe me anymore of this. It just doesn't make sense. And so they say to him, Jesus, give us some more faith. To which, and I didn't put the verse up here because it talks about a mustard seed, and we have no clue what that means. But here's Jesus' basic response. Guys, this isn't about faith. It's not about having more or less. This is about living out the faith you have. He says the issue for you and the issue for me is not that we need more faith. What we need to do is just follow the faith we have. And it's easy to look at this passage and say, well, but Jesus is saying there, if they ask for forgiveness, that's when I give forgiveness. But there's other places where Jesus says other stuff about forgiveness and doing it before it happens. So let me walk through a quick little list of doing forgiveness this morning. Today is just a primer for the next coming weeks. I just want to get this idea going through all of our minds, because as we break it down each week, I want you to begin to understand kind of how this all fits in. But here's just some steps. Number one, to do forgiveness, you need to identify who you are angry with. For some of you, that is not hard to do. You know who you're angry with. I'd ask you if they were sitting close to you, but I don't want to have it even get worse today, all right? If I'm looking out there and you give me kind of one of those without moving your head, I'll know where we're at, right? But you need to identify who you're angry with, because you're angry with somebody. And if you don't kind of know who it is, it's the person you have all those imaginary conversations with. Those ones, but by the way, you never lose, right? I told them this. I want to tell them that. But you need to figure out who it is, to identify them, to know what that face is, right? And because that leads us to, once you need to figure out who you're angry with, it leads us to step two, which is to determine what they owe you. Now, we often pass over this because we got our story. In fact, some of you, your story has changed over the years, and you're not even really sure why you're so angry at this person, but you've been telling the story for years. And you just got to keep telling the story. But one of the best things you can do is to figure out, write a list of who are the people you're angry with. And then actually begin to write down a list of what they owe you. What they took, because they took something from you. Maybe they took away your childhood. Maybe they took away your innocence. Maybe they took away your money. For some of you, this is a literal thing. What do they owe you? You haven't figured out. They owe me $5,000, 251 cents, right? You got to kind of figure out. You know what they owe you. But the reality is, the reason that you have a hard time forgetting is because they owe you something. And you need to know what that something is. You got a divorce. So they took away your sense of having a family, this idea of this thing lasting. They fired you from that job, that sense of security you had. So you need to figure this out. You need to figure out who it is and determine what they owe you, because it leads us to number three, what you need to decide to cancel the debt, which is the hardest of them all, but is the most important of them all. Because if you have hung on to this thing for a long, long time, I have a simple, deep question to ask you this morning. How's that working for you? Because if it's not working, and it hasn't for years, maybe it's time to think about canceling this debt. Saying, you don't owe me anymore, because yes, you owed me, but because here's the reality. If they tried to pay you back, could they really pay you back? There are some people that you are angry at still, and they are no longer living. There's no way they can pay you back. But you think about the people that have taken, have you lost that job? You lost that relationship? You lost that connection? Is there really anything they could do to fully restore you to that spot? And the answer is, you're a bright group. You don't need me to tell you that, right? You're a bright group. And so you find yourself in this great, terrible quandary. They owe me. I know who it is. I know what they owe me. But I know that even if they tried to pay me back, they couldn't pay me back because you can't get back stuff. And so I'm left with saying they owe me, but impossible for them to repay me. Some point, I have to recognize that it hasn't been working great, and I have to be willing to decide to cancel the debt. It's moving beyond, I should forgive them, to I have forgiven them. And then the last step may be even more important than this third step, that is the hardest step. You need to have one of those moments at the end of all those cooking shows when they have the countdown, right? 10, 9, 8, finish, and they step back from the table, right? To just let it go. Because the reality is, if you hold on to it, it will eat you up. And you may not think it's coloring all of your relationships, but it does. You know, you've heard the lines, like, bitterness, unforgiveness. It's like drinking rat poison and expecting the rat to die. And then there's all these different variations of that. And it's so true. Because remember those times when you were really mad at somebody? Because they had hurt you, they had done something to you, and you were having a conversation with somebody, and you found out they had no clue that they had done that to you? Really made you feel smart at that moment, didn't it? You're like, really? What they did to me, it hurt so bad. And they're like, hey, nothing doesn't matter. Which ought to tell us something about ourselves. And something about our need. Something about our struggle. Listen, you will never find motivation to forgive by focusing on the person who hurt you. All you will do will get more and more and more and more ticked off. Especially if they're dead. But you will only find it by focusing on the one who forgave you. Apart from the reality of your own forgiveness, forgiveness will always be a struggle. That was the high point, by the way, folks. Yeah. I didn't do a great build-up of it. I apologize. But this is it. I'll try it one more time. Apart from the reality of your own forgiveness, forgiveness will always be a struggle. Thank you. Yeah. We actually ought to be clapping for Jesus, because that's actually Jesus' point. What Jesus is after in your life and in your life and in your life and your life and even in my life is that we would understand that forgiveness does not make sense outside of a person who's been forgiven. And even for a person who's been forgiven, it doesn't always make sense. But what Jesus hopes happens is, as we think more and more about what we've been forgiven and how we've been forgiven by Him, that at some point it sinks in and we go, yeah, you're right. That I can't separate this from me and what I experience with you, because that's what you keep telling me. Because when I try to do it, I feel good with you, but I feel bad with a lot of other people. See, sometimes we ask ourselves this question. Can I treat others less than how God has treated me? Because I have a story, by the way. And let me tell you that story of why I should be able to do this, because you have no idea how this person has affected me over the years. And what they did. And how it hurt. And what I couldn't do. And what was taken from me. But Jesus hopes we ask this question of how. How can I treat others less than how God has treated me? It's a matter of adding a word and of changing our perspective. It's a matter of getting our eyes off of them and that person or those people, because some of you have people, not just a person. And looking in a different direction and getting a different perspective of what forgiveness is and was and might be. So to sum up today, let me tell you, put it this way. So at least you have somebody to forgive. And I'll even ask for forgiveness today. Forgive me for saying this. But you have to forgive. You have no choice. And you may be thinking, well, who do you think you are, Mike? I got plenty of choice. In fact, you just got added to my list, which was my goal, as I told you at the start today. But you have no choice because of the choice you've made to hold on to it. How has that been working? And at some point, for your own sanity, for your own sake, for your own life, for your own relationships, you need to take your hands off it and say, you don't owe me anything. And you don't owe me anymore. And it's not because I'm excusing it. It's not because you've repaid me. It's not because you're worthy now. I'm doing it because, you know what? I understand for myself the value of forgiveness. And the blessing of forgiveness. And the hope of forgiveness. And if I need it, they probably need it as well. Because one of the beliefs we have as Christians, as followers of Jesus, is that we have been forgiven, right? Everybody say that. I have been forgiven. And that's true, even if you're not a Christian, not a believer, you've been forgiven by Jesus. You just haven't recognized it or accepted it, but it's already done. So anybody in this room today, anybody watching online, you could say, I've been forgiven. But here's my question, and I'm going to pray. What if they have been too? By the same one who forgave you. And I'm going to stop there because that's the end of my rhyme. Because I'm just about run out of time. Here we go, all right. Hey, bow your heads. I want to speak something over you today, all right? Listen, you are probably in this place today because you recognize a need in your life. And even if you've been forgiven and you've lived that way for years, you recognize that this is always, 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 always a thing. But I want to remind you again this morning of what was true years ago and was true this morning and will be true this afternoon and this coming week. And that is that when Jesus went to that cross and he died for all of your stuff. The stuff you've done, the stuff you're doing, the stuff you will do. And he died for that because he knew you could not repay those things. And because of that, Jesus will say, and invite us into following him and forgiving others. And if that's a step you need to take today, and listen, I understand, you may not be at that place. I don't think it's 25, 30 minutes here, 38 minutes, whatever the time is here. And I'm going to change your mind, but it's not my job to change your mind. All I ask you to do is to say to God, I may not like it, I may not quite be ready for it, but I am willing to let you do what only you can do. And that's to change my heart. My job is simply to take my hands off it and let you work. And if that's where you're at, let me just ask you to invite you to follow along as I pray this morning. Lord, that's where a lot of us are right at this moment. And so we ask you, we give you permission to move into our lives and do the work that we cannot do, that for some of us we don't want to do. But we know we have to. And we have to not because you say we have to. We know we have to because we know what being unforgiving has done to us and is doing to us. And so we thank you again for your forgiveness towards us, which means also your forgiveness towards them. So, Father, help me. Help me to figure out who they are and what they owe me, so that I can be clear when I finally say, you don't owe me anything anymore, and to walk away and to leave it with you. And if you can begin that process today and move it on forward tomorrow, I think, and I believe that I'll be happy. Happier tomorrow, happier in a few months, and especially happier forever. In your name, amen.